The goats found the well, but it was Wren Calloway who understood what the finding meant. She heard at first a sound that did not belong in the dry crackle of a September afternoon in New Mexico territory. Not the familiar scrape of a hoof on packed caliche or the soft percussion of 50 animals moving through brush. Something hollow, something that spoke of depth rather than surface. A resonant clack that climbed up from the highest point of her 60 acres and found her where she stood at the edge of the property, her hand still resting on the deed she had folded into her coat pocket not 20 minutes earlier. She was not yet listening for answers. She was still learning the questions. 3 days before that afternoon, Wren had walked into the Cobra County clerk's office with the last of her money folded inside the cover of a leather-bound surveyor's notebook. The notebook had belonged to her husband James, who had spent 11 years reading the grammar of soil and stone across the territories before a fever took him in the spring of 1881. His handwriting filled the pages in the cramped, precise script of a man who believed that land had things to say if you were patient enough to listen. Wren had read every entry in those pages so many times that she could recite them without opening the cover, but she still opened it. The act of reading James's words felt like continuing a conversation rather than consulting a record. The clerk, a man named Doyle, whose suspenders had absorbed 2 decades of ink and tobacco, studied her over the rim of his spectacles, with the particular expression of someone watching a stranger walk toward a hole in the ice. Wren set the notebook open on his desk to a page James had marked with a strip of rawhide. The entry was brief limestone outcrop North Ridge above Harlan's Crossing. Exposed cap formation. Estimated depth 40 to 60 feet to aquifer. Someone asked this question before us. Doyle read it twice. His expression did not change. He slid the notebook back across the counter as though it were slightly damp. That parcel is called Garrett's Folly, Mrs. Calloway. Has been for 15 years. Silas Garrett brought in a crew to core for silver back in '68 and pulled up nothing but dust. He walked away and let the taxes go to ruin. Doyle paused, giving the silence room to do persuasive work. It's 60 acres of catclaw mesquite and limestone shelf. No creek line, no documented water source. The previous 3 owners acquired it for back taxes and let it go the same way. Wren's eyes moved to the county plat map tacked behind his chair. The parcel sat north of Harlan's Crossing like a blank square on a chessboard. No blue lines of surface water, no notations of pasture or tillage, just the mapmaker's shorthand, scrub and rock. Garrett drilled for silver, she said. My husband surveyed for water. Those are 2 different conversations with the same ground. Doyle took a long breath through his nose. He looked at the money she had placed on the counter. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her eyes, which were the color of weathered pewter, and gave nothing back. He processed the deed. The news moved through Harlan's Crossing. The way most news moved through a small town in 1883, faster than a horse, slower than the truth. By the time Wren had walked her carpet bag to the boarding house on Minor Street, the Golden Spur Saloon already had a running wager on how many days she would last before selling back to the county. Harlan's Crossing was not a cruel town. It was a practical one which sometimes amounted to the same thing. Its economy ran on cattle water and the certainty that Silas Garrett understood both better than anyone else in Cobra County. Garrett was 58 years old, a former Confederate officer who had moved west after Appomattox and turned his talent for logistics into a cattle empire. He sat his horse with the straight-backed authority of a man who had spent the years between 1861 and 1865 commanding others to hold positions. He controlled the largest herd in the territory, held a contractual stake in the town's public well through an agreement with the town council signed in 1879, and had been expanding his land holdings quietly for a decade, always patient, always waiting for circumstances to make the price favorable. When word reached him that a widow from Albuquerque had purchased the Folly for back taxes, he reportedly said without looking up from his ledger, "Women buy hope. The ground sells disappointment. This will resolve itself." He was not wrong often enough to have learned caution. Wren spent her first 4 weeks on the property sleeping in a canvas tent staked to the one flat section of ground she could find near the southern fence line. She rose before light each morning, walked the half-mile to the public well on the edge of town, paid the fee that Garrett's arrangement with the council required, and carried 2 buckets back along the rutted road before the heat made the walk punishing. The rest of her daylight hours she spent walking her 60 acres with James's notebook open in her hands. The land was worse than Doyle had suggested. The catclaw mesquite grew in interlocking thickets so dense that a man on horseback could not have pushed through without injury to the animal. The limestone shelf broke the surface in irregular ledges across the upper third of the property, and between the rocky outcrops and the thorn brush, almost nothing usable grew at grade level. The ground was not barren, it was defended. There was a difference, though she understood that most people looking at it would not bother to make the distinction. She made herself walk every foot of it before she made any decisions. She studied the way the terrain sloped. She noted where the caliche hardpan gave way to decomposed limestone, where the rock cap was thickest, where a thin crust of dried moss clung in the shaded angles between stones, moss that needed some source of subsurface moisture to have grown there at all, even if only seasonally. She recorded these details in James's notebook beneath his own entries, her handwriting broader than his, less certain of its elegance, absolutely certain of its purpose. On the 18th day, a woman appeared at her fence line in the early evening without announcement. Ruth Alderman was 70 years old and had arrived in New Mexico Territory in 1851 by wagon from Tennessee, which was itself a kind of credential no amount of money could purchase. Her face carried the record of those years in deep lines that ran not from bitterness, but from squinting at distances, and her white hair was bundled at the back of her neck with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. She owned the small farmstead to the east of Wren's property. Neat, productive, slightly miraculous given the climate, and she had been watching the new arrivals' daily surveys with the attentive patience of someone waiting to see whether an unfamiliar bird would light or keep flying. She looked at Wren's hands, the scratches from the cat claw, the calluses already forming at the base of each finger, and then at the notebook tucked under Wren's arm. "Your husband's," Ruth asked, her Tennessee vowels still audible beneath 40 years of western sun. Wren's hand moved slightly toward the notebook before she stopped it. "He surveyed this area in '79, passed through not a full survey. He made a note about the upper ridge." She paused. "How did you know about the notebook?" Ruth's expression was neither evasive nor particularly illuminating. "I didn't. I knew about men who come through here and write things down that other men ignore." She looked past Wren to the wall of thorn green and gray that filled the property. "The first man who formally surveyed this valley did it in '51. He made the same kind of note your husband made. I know because I was here when he did it, and I read what he wrote before he moved on." The evening had gone copper and long-shadowed. Neither woman moved to conclude the conversation. "He didn't find water," Wren said. "It was not quite a question. He found evidence of it, then he moved on the way surveyors do. The evidence stayed." She studied the limestone ridge visible above the thicket line. "This land isn't empty, Mrs. Calloway. It's private. There is a difference." She let that sit for a moment. "You cannot fight your way in. The thorns will outlast any tool you bring to them. What you need is an army that considers thorns a feature rather than an obstacle." Wren looked at the thicket. "What kind of army does that?" Ruth Alderman almost smiled. "The stubborn kind. Goats, not dairy animals, brush goats. The kind nobody wants because they eat everything. Their mouths are the only key that fits a lock like this." She turned to go, then stopped without turning back. "The land remembers what it holds. You only need to ask it politely to show you." She walked back to her farmstead through the fading light with the unhurried step of a woman who had never wasted motion on drama. The livestock auction in the town of Mescal, 15 miles east, operated every other Thursday in a series of corrals behind the rail depot. Wren arrived on a Thursday in October with a number in her head and the remainder of her working capital distributed between her coat pocket and the inside of her left boot, which she considered a reasonable precaution given the general character of auction yards. The man who ran the brush goat pens was named Breck, weathered to the same color as the fence posts he leaned against, with eyes that performed rapid assessments of livestock and buyers with equal disinterest. He watched Wren move through his pens without comment for the better part of an hour. She was not looking for the animals closest to the gate or the ones with the cleanest coats. She moved through the pen the way James had taught her to read a section of ground methodically without conclusion until the full picture assembled itself. She watched how they moved. She watched which ones sought the fence posts and began stripping bark within seconds of her approach. She watched their eyes, particularly the difference between an animal that registered her presence as a threat, as irrelevant, or as a potential complication to be managed. She wanted the ones that looked at her the way chess players look at a new opponent, measuring not afraid. She selected 48 animals over the course of that hour. Nannies and wethers, primarily with 2 bucks, one young one older with horns that curved back in a long arc, and an expression of settled authority that suggested he had long ago resolved any questions about his place in the hierarchy. She pointed to this one last. Breck scratched the back of his neck. That's the colonel. He'll kick the door down for a turnip and eat your fence post for sport. I don't have a door, Wren said. I have 60 acres of mesquite and catclaw. His opinions about fence posts are irrelevant. Breck looked at her for a moment, really looked the way he studied an animal he was trying to price correctly. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but adjacent to it, the recognition one practical person extends to another. You know what you're buying. I know exactly what I'm buying. The price was low. Brush goats had no market value among people who wanted production animals. They ate indiscriminately tested every barrier ever constructed to contain them, and were deeply uninterested in human sentiment. Among people who needed scrubland cleared, they were the only tool that worked. Wren fell into the second category, and the arithmetic was clear. She walked 50 animals. She had rounded up to 50 by the time Breck added 2 that he threw in out of what she suspected was a combination of pity and professional respect out of the mescal pens and onto the road west toward Harlan's Crossing. The procession took the better part of 3 hours passing through the main street of Harlan's Crossing, at the precise time of day when the maximum number of people were conducting business along its length. Wren kept her eyes level and her pace steady while 50 goats rendered the late afternoon into a small domestic catastrophe of noise and scattered pedestrians. A man standing outside Henderson's Mercantile watched the column pass and delivered his verdict to no one in particular, from thorns to thorns. Wren did not look at him. She was already calculating which section of the thicket the animals would reach first and how long before they created a path wide enough to follow. The boy appeared on the third evening. He materialized at the eastern fence line without announcement, the way children sometimes do when they have decided something is their business without having arrived at a method for explaining why. He was 13 small for it, with the kind of stillness in his face that comes not from temperance, but from having learned early that visible emotion creates vulnerability. His name was Cody Marsh, and his father, Tom, had owned a quarter section south of town until 6 weeks earlier. When the note Garrett held on the property came due at a terms renegotiation that left Tom Marsh with traveling money and nothing else, Cody did not ask for work. He picked up the spare bucket by the tent and walked toward the public well without a word. And when he came back, he set it down and looked at the thicket line where the goats were already making inroads into the lowest layer of vegetation. Wren watched him from the corner of her eye. You know goats. My uncle kept a few. He paused. Nothing like this many. What's your read on the big buck, the one with the curved horns? Cody studied the colonel, who was at that moment standing on his hind legs, with his front hooves braced against a section of mesquite trunk stripping bark with methodical efficiency. He's telling the others where to go. They watch him first. Wren nodded. That was accurate. The colonel had established a pattern in 3 days that the rest of the herd was already deferring to working the perimeter of a section before moving inward, leaving nothing stripped but standing that might obstruct movement. She had not taught them this. It appeared to be a kind of collective intelligence that emerged from the herd's own structure. His name is the colonel, she said. Cody absorbed this without comment. Then what are the others called? She walked him through them, the twin wethers she had named Flint and Gravel, for the way they butted heads constantly with no apparent ill will, the clever nanny called Bess, who had learned in 2 days to open the tent flap with her nose, the young does, with their distinct habits. Cody listened with the focused attention of someone filing information he intended to use. He came back the next morning before she was fully awake. He came the morning after that. He did not ask about wages, and Wren did not raise the subject because the conversation they were actually having about the land, about the animals, about what was possible, required space that explicit negotiation would have collapsed. Instead, she began teaching him to read the goat's movements the way she read the land, as a language with grammar and consequence, not merely a spectacle. By the end of October, the colonel had led the herd 30 yards into the thicket, and the ground behind them was open for the first time in what the condition of the suppressed root system suggested was decades. Native grasses, side oats, grama, blue grama, poverty 3 on, were already sending up tentative green shoots in the cleared patches, responding to sudden access to light with the insistence of things that had been waiting rather than dying. Wren recorded the cleared acreage in the notebook. She added a small notation in the margin of James's limestone entry. They found the path. Following. The wager at the Golden Spur moved. The over-under on her departure shifted from 30 days to 60, then to 90, as the weeks passed and the woman on the Folly failed to exhibit the behaviors associated with impending failure. She did not sell off animals. She did not make inquiries at the bank. She did not appear at the Golden Spur, the boarding house, or any of the social contexts where a person in difficulty might surface looking for rescue. What she did was work with a consistency that the town could observe if it cared to look the smoke from her cook fire each morning before light the figures of herself and the boy, moving along the fence line in the evenings, the gradual recession of the thicket's boundary on the upper slope. Silas Garrett rode past her fence line on a Wednesday afternoon in late November without stopping. He sat his horse at the road's edge for a full minute, looking at the cleared section, the stacked firewood, the goats moving through the remaining brush with their quiet industry. His face gave nothing definitive away. Then he rode on. Wren was 30 yards inside the property line when he passed. She watched him through a gap in the remaining brush. He was a man who had spent his career reading situations for leverage, and he had just updated his ledger. She turned back to the fence post she was setting. The ground here was limestone shelf 3 inches down, and the post required patience rather than force. She worked the bar carefully, finding the joints in the stone, pressing the advantage of patience over power. The post seated itself in the gap she created. The land was beginning to answer her questions. She was learning to ask better ones. The winter of 1883 did not stop the goats. It slowed them the way cold slows a river without stopping its movement. But the colonel established a rhythm that the herd held through December and into January, working the protected south-facing sections where the limestone shelf absorbed what weak sun the short days offered, stripping bark from the dormant mesquite, eating the dried seed pods that hung from the cat claw like small brown fists. Wren followed their progress each morning, recording cleared acreage in the margin columns James had left blank, adding her measurements to his observations, the way a second voice completes a sentence begun by someone no longer in the room. By February, the pace changed. The light shifted in that particular way it does in New Mexico at the end of winter, not warm yet, but longer, with a quality of attention that the land responds to before any thermometer confirms it. The native grasses came up fast in the sections the goats had cleared the previous autumn. The root systems had been there all along, suppressed by the decades of canopy the mesquite thicket had imposed, waiting with the patient arithmetic of things that measure time in seasons rather than days. The goats ate the new growth, grew sleek on it, produced more milk than the previous month produced kids in March that added 23 animals to the herd in 6 weeks. The math of the land had shifted from subtraction to multiplication, and Wren felt the change in her bones before she could put words to it. She built the milking stand with Cody in early April, rough frame from the mesquite wood the goats had killed, and she had dried through the winter functional without being elaborate. Set on the flattest section of cleared ground, near what had become a proper one-room structure of stacked limestone and salvaged lumber. Roofed with corrugated tin she had traded 3 wheels of cheese for at Henderson's Mercantile. It was not a house by any generous definition. It was a position, a statement that she was not camping on the land but inhabiting it. Ruth Alderman came in the second week of April carrying a small cheesecloth bundle that turned out to contain a round of starter culture she had maintained since Tennessee. She sat with Wren at the rough table outside the stone structure, and over the course of an afternoon, she transmitted a knowledge that could not be recorded in a notebook. The temperature of the milk at the moment of addition, the pressure of the hand pressing the curds, the smell of the aging cave that told you whether the process was proceeding or failing. Her hands moved through the demonstration with the confidence of 40 years, and Wren's hands followed, learning the grammar of a different kind of patience. The first wheel came out of the hacked stone aging cellar Wren had dug into the hillside 6 weeks later. Ruth tasted a sliver cut from the edge, holding it on her tongue with her eyes on the middle distance. "This has the taste of limestone and sun," Ruth said. "Honest cheese, the kind that knows where it came from." Wren began delivering 2 wheels a week to Henderson's Mercantile, carrying them wrapped in cloth in a wooden crate Cody had built from salvaged slats. She did not explain the source when Henderson asked. She exchanged the cheese for flour salt coffee, the occasional tool she needed. Henderson's curiosity was visible and unsatisfied, which suited her. The town's understanding of what was happening on the Folly was running several months behind the reality, and she saw no reason to close that gap prematurely. Then, in December of 1883, Garrett had moved his first piece on the board. The notice went up on the public well housing the second Monday of the month, a single sheet in Doyle's official clerk hand stamped with the county seal, announcing a 40% increase in well usage fees, effective January 1st, citing infrastructure maintenance costs. The explanation was technically defensible. The timing, arriving in the same season as a modest drought had begun reducing Copper Creek's flow, was not coincidental. 3 families had already begun conversations with Garrett's land agent about their properties by February. Tom Marsh signed the transfer paperwork on a Tuesday in March, accepting terms that left him enough to relocate to Las Cruces, but nothing else. Cody had not been present for the signing. He had been at Wren's property helping set fence posts along the northern boundary. He found out from a neighbor's child on the road home that evening. He arrived at the fence line the next morning at the regular hour, his face carrying whatever it carries when a person has made a decision about how they intend to respond to something that cannot be undone. Wren did not address it directly. She set him to work on the section of milking stand that needed reinforcing, working beside him, letting the physical rhythm of the task occupy the foreground. An hour in, without looking up from the brace she was fitting, "Your father made the only decision he could with what he had." Cody drove a nail with more force than the wood required. He had the land. He had a note held by a man who decided when it came due. She tested the brace. That's not the same as having land. The distinction did not comfort him, which she had not expected it to, but it settled between them as a fact rather than a consolation, and there was a different quality in the way he worked for the rest of that day, not harder exactly, but with a direction to it that had not been there before. The well fees cut into Wren's operating margin in ways she had calculated and found uncomfortable, but survivable. She reduced her own water consumption to what was strictly necessary, prioritizing the herd. She dug a shallow collection trench along the eastern slope of the cleared section to capture whatever runoff the spring rains offered, gaining perhaps a quarter of what she needed, but a quarter she did not have to pay Garrett's rate for. She did not mention the fee increase to Ruth, to Cody, or to anyone in town. Complaint was a transaction she had decided early to remove from her available currency. By June of 1884, the nature of the problem had changed entirely. The spring rains that the territory expected in April had not materialized. A few brief showers in early May settled the dust without penetrating the ground to any useful depth. By the first week of June, Copper Creek had reduced from its normal modest flow to a series of disconnected pools connected by muddy seeps. By the last week of June, the pools were shrinking. By the second week of July, the creek bed was a cracked scar running through the valley floor, pale as old bone under the merciless clarity of a sky that had forgotten clouds. The mood in Harlan's Crossing shifted with a speed that surprised even people who had lived through dry years before. The public well, drawing from a shallower aquifer than anyone had fully mapped, began dropping. The labored squeak of the pump handle became the town's unhappiest daily sound, the noise of something working too hard for too little return. Garrett's arrangement with the council gave him preferential access at terms that allowed his operation to absorb the reduced supply better than smaller users. His cattle suffered visible in the dropped weight of animals large enough to show the impact of reduced water intake at distance, but they did not begin dying. Smaller operations did not have the same buffer. The price of a barrel of water hauled by wagon from Dry Fork River 12 miles east, its own flow diminished but not yet failed, climbed to levels that made the calculation brutal for any family already running thin margins. Garrett purchased 2 more properties in July. A third family loaded their wagon in early August and left without selling, simply abandoning a claim they could no longer defend. On Wren's 60 acres, the effects of the drought were real, but not catastrophic in the way they were playing out in the valley below. The native grasses, with their deep root systems, evolved for exactly this kind of seasonal violence, clung to life while the imported pasture grasses on surrounding properties burned to straw. The goats, as browsers rather than grazers, could extract moisture from the deep-rooted mesquite that still stood in the uncleared sections, supplementing what Wren hauled from the increasingly expensive town well. She reduced the herd's water allocation by a third, then by half. She watched the animals for signs that the root systems were failing. They held, barely in places, but they held. One evening in late July, she sat outside the stone structure with the notebook in her lap open to James's limestone entry. The valley below was visible in the long horizontal light brown, where it had been gold gray, where it had been green, the skeletal shapes of cattle visible at intervals along the dry creek bed. She had made this land productive through patience labor calculation, the cooperation of 50 animals who understood the ground better than the men who had dismissed it. The question that arrived in the stillness of that evening was not whether she had been wrong to come here. The question was whether James had been right about what lay beneath the ridge, or whether his notebook entry was the record of a hope rather than an observation. She closed the notebook. She did not open it again that evening. Some questions deserved to be held, not answered too quickly. In the first week of August, she noticed the colonel's behavior change. It was subtle enough that she might have missed it if she had not spent 8 months learning to read the herd as a text with specific grammar. He had always ranged widely, establishing the day's territory with a loop of the perimeter before settling into the work of the section the herd would clear that session. In early August, he began truncating the lower sections of his morning survey, moving the herd progressively uphill toward the limestone shelf on the upper ridge where the thicket had been thinnest, and the goats had consequently cleared it earliest. There was no new vegetation to account for the preference. The cleared upper sections offered shorter, older grass that the lower section's stronger growth had surpassed as a food source. He was not going there to eat. Wren noted this without conclusion. She began following the morning survey more closely, watching where the colonel paused, how long he remained at specific points on the upper ridge. Cody noticed her attention shift. "He's listening for something," Cody offered one morning, watching the colonel stand motionless at a section of exposed limestone flat, his large ears rotating slowly. Wren looked at the stone beneath the colonel's hooves. Flat, wide, roughly circular, the diameter of a wagon wheel. The surface was swept clean by weeks of hooves moving over it. A thin, dark line of dried moss outlined its circumference, the trace of moisture that had once reached the surface from somewhere below, long since evaporated, but leaving its record in the stone. "How long has he been standing there?" she asked. Cody thought back. 10 days, maybe 12. She had been watching for 8. She knelt beside the stone, pressing her palm flat against its surface. The heat of the August afternoon had penetrated every exposed surface for 100 yards in every direction. Every rock, every patch of caliche, every piece of metal she owned radiated the accumulated temperature of a day that had reached 104 degrees by noon. The stone was cool. Not relatively cool, the modest differential of a heavier mass absorbing heat more slowly. Cool the way a root cellar is cool. Cool because something below it was maintaining a temperature that the surface world above could not touch. She stood. She looked at Cody. Get the long pry bar, she said. The one we use for the fence post in the north section. He was already moving. It took them 40 minutes to break the seal, not because the stone was impossibly heavy, though it required both of them at full effort, but because the fit between the stone cap and the rim of what lay beneath had been made by hands that understood permanence. Each time they gained a fraction of movement, the weight redistributed and the seal re-engaged. Wren worked the bar methodically, finding the angle that used leverage rather than force moving around the circumference. Cody braced each gain with a wooden wedge he split from a mesquite length with the hatchet. The stone moved on the fourth circuit of effort. A sliver of darkness appeared at the eastern edge of the cap, and from that sliver came something that stopped them both mid-motion. Cold air. Not the faint differential of shaded rock, but a genuine exhalation of underground temperature, the breath of a space that had been sealed since before either of them was born. It carried the smell of wet limestone, of mineral dark water of depth measured in feet rather than inches. They looked at each other across the partial gap. Neither spoke. They finished the work in silence, sliding the capstone aside until the opening was fully exposed. A circular shaft, perhaps 30 inches across, descended into darkness. The walls were fitted limestone, each course laid with the kind of care that speaks of intention rather than expedient, stone selected for flatness, fitted without mortar by hands that knew the work would need to stand without maintenance for years they could not count. The workmanship was not rough frontier construction. Someone had built this to last generations. Wren went for the rope. She returned with the longest line she had, 60 feet of hemp heavy gauge, used for hauling lumber, tied the handle of a water bucket to one end with the knot James had taught her for load-bearing applications, and began lowering it into the shaft. The rope uncoiled from her hands foot by foot. 10, 20. The walls of the shaft were invisible below the reach of the afternoon light within a few yards of descent. 30 feet. 40. She was counting under her breath, feeling the weight of the bucket unchange the rope dropping freely into darkness. 45, 47. The resistance changed. The rope went from taut with the bucket's weight to a sudden brief slack, and a sound climbed up the stone shaft that was completely unlike anything the August afternoon had produced. A soft liquid impact, immediate, resonant, the report of something striking a water surface with depth beneath it. The echo that followed was the echo of a space with no false bottom. She waited. The rope went heavier. She hauled it up hand over hand, and the hemp grew dark with moisture as it rose, then wet, then dripping steadily onto the limestone around the shaft opening. The bucket emerged into sunlight, filled to its rim with water so clear the bottom was visible through it. The temperature of the bucket against her hands was startling cold, the way a mountain spring is cold, cold that belonged to a different geography than the one they were standing in. She drank from her cup palm. The taste was clean mineral sweetness, with a crispness that spoke of filtration through limestone over distances and timescales she could not calculate. It was the best water she had tasted in 3 years. Cody drank. His face, which had held its careful composure through 40 minutes of hard work and the building weight of what they were beginning to understand, broke open into an expression she had not seen there before. Uncalculated, unguarded, the face of a 13-year-old boy confronting something that exceeded the categories available to him. "There's a whole river down there," he whispered. Not a river. An aquifer, a slow, deep movement of water through limestone that had collected the memory of every rain the territory had received over decades, filtered it, stored it at depth where evaporation could not reach it, held it for exactly the kind of dry year that was killing everything in the valley below. Someone had found it, had understood what they found, had built a shaft to access it with skill that reflected genuine geological knowledge. Then they had sealed it for reasons she could not yet know and left. She placed the bucket on the stone beside the shaft. She looked at the fitted walls, the perfect circumference, the depth of craft embedded in every course of stone. This was not a thing built quickly or carelessly. Whoever made it had expected it to outlast them, and it had. "We put it back," she said. Cody looked up. "We seal it again, tonight. No one comes up here without us knowing, and we don't say anything to anyone." Her voice carried the same steadiness it had carried in Doyle's office 14 months earlier, not raised for effect, simply projected to the distance required. A secret is only a secret until you need it to be something else. Right now, we need it to be a secret. Cody was quiet for a moment, reading her the way he had learned to read the herd, watching for what the surface expression was covering. Because of Garrett. Not a question. He was 13 years old and had watched his father lose a property to a note renegotiation, and he understood leverage the way children understand it when they have seen it applied to someone they love. Because of Garrett, she confirmed. But not only that, because I need one night to think and one morning to act, and in this valley, those two things require privacy. They replaced the capstone as the sun dropped toward the western ridge, coaxing the heavy disc back over the shaft opening until the fit re-engaged with a solidity that would not betray itself to casual inspection. Wren packed the seam with caliche dust. By the time the evening light had gone from copper to gray, the upper ridge of her 60 acres looked exactly as it had that morning. She stood at the stone structure's doorway after Cody had gone, looking up at the ridge in the dark. Below, across the valley, the lights of Harlan's Crossing were visible. The Golden Spur, the Mercantile, the boarding house, the ring of dark properties where families were making calculations about water time and what they could afford to lose. She had one night. She intended to use it. The secret lasted 11 days. Wren had known, in the way she knew most things through observation rather than intuition, that the margin for containment was narrow. A boy of 13 carrying knowledge of that magnitude through a town contracting with thirst was not a failure of character waiting to happen. It was a law of pressure, as reliable as water finding its level. The only variable was where the seal would give. It gave at the livery stable on a Wednesday evening in the third week of August. Cody had finished his work on the property and walked to town for the night, as he did most evenings. A hand from one of the eastern operations, a lean, sun-cracked man named Walt, who worked for the Breckenridge outfit, was sitting on a hay bale complaining with the specific eloquence of someone who has run out of other options. The Breckenridge well had failed that afternoon. Complete failure, the pump pulling air, the bucket coming up dry. Walt's employer was now looking at 12 miles to Dry Fork River for every drop the operation needed over a road that the August heat had turned to loose powder 6 inches deep. 2 more weeks of this, Walt said to the livery's general atmosphere, and Breckenridge sells to Garrett at whatever Garrett offers. Man's patient as a rock. Cody was silent for the length of time it takes a person to make a decision they have not fully examined. Then quietly, the words finding their way out through a gap in his composure that exhaustion had created, "We've got water." Walt stopped. The specific quality of his stillness was the stillness of a man who has been thirsty for weeks, hearing a sound he cannot immediately categorize. "What's that?" Cody heard himself. He attempted a recovery, a mumbled half retraction, something about the collection trench, the small amounts gathered from runoff. But the original statement had carried a weight that no revision could reassign. Walt had heard the difference between a boy talking about a trench full of cloudy rainwater and a boy talking about something that made him lower his voice. Cody came back to the property that night and told Wren what had happened before he had taken his boots off, standing in the doorway with his face stripped of its usual composure, delivering the fact plainly because there was no other way to deliver it. Wren listened. She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, the exhaustion in his face, the particular quality of a person who has already begun cataloging their mistake. "You told the truth to someone who needed it," she said. "That's not a sin. The timing was not ideal." She stood. "Go sleep. I have an errand before Doyle closes his office." Cody blinked. "Doyle works late on Wednesdays. County filing night." She was already reaching for her coat. The county clerk's office was lit at 9 o'clock when Wren arrived, Doyle working through a stack of land transfer documents at his desk with the resigned efficiency of a man who had made peace with long hours. He looked up when she entered, read something in her expression that caused him to set his pen down. She placed a prepared document on his desk. Voluntary property declaration drafted in her own hand over the previous 10 days, specifying the well as a community water resource, non-commercial designation, open access provision. She had prepared it 3 days after sealing the shaft, when she had understood clearly enough what Garrett would do the moment the secret escaped. Doyle read it carefully. He looked at the clock. He looked at her. He stamped it with the county seal and recorded the filing time, 9:15, August 19th, 1884. "This limits your options considerably, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "It limits his options considerably," she replied. "Mine are exactly where I need them." By the time Wren saw the first light of the following morning to find the ridgeline of her property, the information had completed its circuit through Harlan's Crossing. She knew it before anyone arrived knew it, the way you know weather from a change in the quality of the air rather than visible evidence. She built the morning fire-heated water for coffee, sat with her thoughts, and the silence of the property she had spent 14 months learning to read. She was ready before she heard the first footsteps on the road. They came as a procession rather than a mob, which told her something about the nature of what drought does to people when it goes on long enough. Mobs have energy. This group moved with the particular exhaustion of people who have already burned through anger, through denial, through the various stages of a crisis, and arrived at the flat territory of simple need. Mothers carrying buckets, men leading horses whose ribs had become countable, children walking with the lassitude of small bodies that had been short on water longer than small bodies should be. Wren stood at her gate. She looked at each face with the steady attention she brought to reading the herd, to reading the land, to reading every text that mattered. She saw people who had laughed in October of 1883. She saw people who had placed wagers. She saw people who had watched her pass on the road without acknowledgement, people who had made their judgments and held them comfortably until comfort was no longer available. She also saw Harv Decker. Decker was the man who had stood outside Henderson's Mercantile when she walked the goats through town and delivered his verdict to the afternoon air. He stood now at the back of the group with his hat in his hands, not pushing forward, not making eye contact. The hat held in the hands was a significant piece of information. She filed it. Something moved in her chest that she took a moment to identify. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction would have required her to have wanted this particular reversal, and she had not wanted it. What she had wanted was to make the land productive, to honor James's notebook, to prove to herself that she had read the ground correctly. What she felt now was closer to the specific grief of a person who sees suffering that was not necessary, who sees a community that organized itself around the wrong assessment of what was possible and understands the cost of that error in the faces in front of her. She did not open the gate immediately. She turned back toward the stone structure, walked inside, sat on the edge of the cot. Cody stood in the doorway, his face doing the careful work of revealing nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the floor, at the packed earth that had started as a tent floor 14 months ago, and now bore the evidence of a household in the scuff marks, the worn path to the door, the particular quality of ground that has been lived on rather than merely occupied. She thought about the people outside her fence, not as the community that had dismissed her, but as the community she was standing in the middle of, whether she had chosen it or not. She thought about James, who had made his notation and moved on trusting that the record would find the right reader. She thought about the family that had built the well and sealed it for whoever comes next. That phrase had not been a restriction. It had been an instruction. She stood. She walked back to the gate and opened it. She had barely turned to face the crowd when a new dust cloud on the south road announced an arrival of a different order entirely. Silas Garrett came with 3 riders flanking him. A man in a brown suit carrying a leather document case across his saddle, and a second man in a city coat that had not been purchased in New Mexico territory, the Santa Fe lawyer named Beaumont, whose reputation in land acquisition disputes had preceded him to Cobre County by several years. Garrett himself rode the big gray horse, sitting it with the straight-backed authority that had not left him since the war. He had known before midnight. He had made 3 decisions, sent 2 riders, prepared documents. The machinery of his response had been in motion for hours before Wren's Gate had acquired its audience. Garrett dismounted with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided the situation is already resolved. He surveyed the assembled townspeople with an expression that managed to convey both sympathy for their condition and confirmation of a point he had always held. Then he looked at Wren with something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same region of the face. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice carried the particular resonance of a man accustomed to open ground. "It appears the county has a matter to discuss with you. An undisclosed water resource on a taxed property constitutes an assessable asset under territorial statute. Mr. Beaumont has the relevant filings." He gestured toward the lawyer without looking at him. "There will be a formal assessment of the resource's capacity. Back taxes on the corrected valuation will be calculated from the date of acquisition." He paused, letting the mathematics work on the audience. "I imagine the county would be willing to accept the property itself in satisfaction of the liability, given the circumstances." The assembled townspeople absorbed this. The hope that had brought them up the road shifted register, becoming something harder to sustain. Wren watched it happen in their faces, the recognition that the trap had closed around her, that Garrett had arrived with lawyers, while they had arrived with buckets. Beaumont opened his document case with the practiced motion of a man for whom paperwork is a weapon kept sharp. Wren did not look at Garrett. She did not look at Beaumont. She looked at the townspeople, specifically at a woman in the middle of the group, whose youngest child was perhaps 4 years old, leaning against her mother's leg with the lassitude of a child who has been short on water for longer than a child should be. She reached into her coat pocket. She held up the filed declaration where Beaumont could see it before she spoke. "Voluntary property declaration filed with the Cobourg County Clerk at 9:15 on the evening of August 19th. Her voice was level, carrying the same quality it had carried in Doyle's office 14 months earlier. Not raised for effect, not modulated for persuasion, simply projected to the distance required. The resource is documented as a community water access point, non-commercial designation, open access provision. Filed before any county inquiry was initiated." She looked at Beaumont directly. "The assessment statute Mr. Garrett is referencing applies to undisclosed commercial assets. This resource has been disclosed. Its designation is non-commercial. Your filing has no basis." The lawyer's expression changed with the slower, more controlled adjustment of a man recalculating. He looked at the document. He looked at the date notation in Doyle's hand. He leaned toward Garrett and spoke in a register below the range of the gathered audience. Whatever he said made Garrett's face do something she had not seen it do in 14 months of watching him. It went still in the wrong way, not the stillness of a man composing his next move, but the stillness of a man whose next move has been removed from the board. She turned away from both of them. She faced the townspeople, and she spoke the terms she had worked out in the hours between sealing the shaft and standing here. "There is water," she said. "Deep water, clean water, more than sufficient for this drought season. It was here before any of us came to this valley. The people who built the shaft that reaches it sealed it for the dry years for whoever came after them. I found it because my husband read the ground correctly 5 years ago, and I followed his notes." She let that fact stand without embellishment. "The terms for access are these: 5 cents per bucket for those who have it. 1 hour of labor on this property in exchange for 10 buckets for those who cannot pay. No charge of any kind for families with children who cannot provide labor. You take what your household needs for 1 day. You do not stockpile. You do not resell. You treat each other fairly in the line." The silence that followed had a specific quality. It was not the silence of people waiting for more information. It was the silence of people adjusting to a generosity they had not prepared for, one that made the calculation they had expected, the negotiation, the leverage, the price set by desperation, entirely beside the point. Garrett stood behind her at the fence line with his lawyer and his riders and his documents, and there was nothing left for any of them to do. She had not beaten him in a legal proceeding. She had not outbid him in a property negotiation. She had simply done something that made his entire vocabulary of pressure irrelevant. You cannot foreclose on a community resource. You cannot tax an act of generosity into submission. You cannot make a crowd of thirsty people resent a woman who just gave them water on terms designed to protect the poorest among them, regardless of what documents you arrived with. He mounted the gray horse without speaking. The lawyer closed the document case. The riders turned their animals. The procession moved back down the south road with a particular lack of ceremony that attends a retreat made before a single blow has been thrown. Harv Decker waited until Garrett was 50 yards down the road. Then he walked forward through the crowd and placed a coin on the fence post with the deliberate attention of a man performing an act he intends to remember. "1 bucket, Mrs. Calloway." His voice carried the rough texture of someone working through multiple things at once. "I owe you more than that, and I suspect we both know it." Wren looked at him. His face was sun-damaged honest in its discomfort, the face of a man who had spent 14 months being wrong about something important and was now integrating that fact into whatever came next. "1 bucket is the price," she said. "Come back tomorrow if you need more." She turned to the well. The line organized itself with the natural efficiency of people who have been waiting long enough to be ready. Wren lowered the bucket while Cody managed the queue, keeping the spacing, directing people to set their coins on the post or to speak with him about the labor arrangement. The rope went down the shaft, the water came up cold and clear, and the sound of it, the rope paying out the distant soft impact. The rope returning heavy became the rhythm of the afternoon in the way the goats' work had once been the rhythm of her days. She worked until the light went long, until the last family in the line had filled their containers, until the road back to Harlan's Crossing carried the sound of water moving in buckets rather than the silence of a town running dry. In the weeks that followed, the labor debts were paid with a thoroughness she had not fully anticipated. Men who had mocked the folly came to build fence, clear stone, extend the cleared acreage into sections she had not yet reached. A proper wall went up around the well shaft, limestone, fitted without mortar in the manner of the original construction, built by hands, learning a skill as they applied it. When it was finished, someone produced a chisel and cut letters into the capstone of the east face Wren's Well, 1884. She was not present when they cut the letters. She was at the upper fence line working with Cody on a section the summer's goat activity had finally opened. She learned about the inscription from Cody, who reported it with the same neutral delivery he applied to most facts, then watched her face for whatever response she was willing to display. She displayed less than she felt. That seemed appropriate. Ruth Alderman came on the morning after the first rain, which arrived in the second week of September, as a low-gray system that moved in from the northwest and proceeded to take its time. Not the violent cloudburst the territory sometimes offered as false relief, but the slow, deep soak that actually penetrated, that reached the root systems that had Copper Creek running again as a genuine waterway within 36 hours. Wren stood in the rain for a while without going inside, because rain after a drought of that length requires acknowledgement before it requires shelter. Ruth came in the afternoon when the rain had settled to a steady, quiet drizzle. She walked to the well wall, ran her hand along the new limestone facing, looked at the letters in the capstone. Then she looked at the 60 acres visible from that vantage, the goats moving in the wet grass with the contentment of animals, whose needs are met, the stone structure with its tin roof, the cleared sections where native grass was already deepening its color in the moisture. "The people who sealed it," Wren said. She had been turning this over since August. "I found something in the back of the notebook, a diagram of the shaft tucked between the last pages, a different hand, older ink paper that had been folded for a long time, a note at the bottom." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The drizzle moved through the air between them. "They built it during the drought of '53, Ruth said at last. "A family named Whitfield came out from Kentucky in '49 with the first wave. Father, 2 sons, a daughter. They found the aquifer, built the shaft, used it through 2 terrible seasons. Then the father died, the sons went to California for the gold fields, the daughter married a man in Albuquerque and followed." She paused. "They sealed it before they left. The father had made them promise before he passed. He said the dry years would come again, and he wanted the well intact for when they did, for whoever had the sense to find it." Wren looked at the capstone with its fresh-cut letters. She thought about a man in 1853 making his children promise to seal a well before leaving land that had outlasted him. Not because he believed anyone specific would return, but because he believed in the existence of a person who would eventually come with the right questions. She thought about James moving through this valley in 1879, reading stone formations, writing his cramped, precise notes, trusting that the record he left would find someone capable of following it. The chain of knowledge running through the ground beneath her feet, Whitfield to James to her across 30 years, across death, across the indifferent interval of drought and abandonment, was not mystical. It was the most practical thing she had ever encountered. Knowledge passed forward is the only inheritance that cannot be taxed, seized, or bought at a forced sale. He was right, she said. The dry years came again. Ruth's expression held the particular warmth of someone who has watched a thing unfold over time and finds the outcome neither surprising nor any less moving for having been expected. The land does not forget what it holds. A person who learns to ask it politely will eventually hear the answer. She stayed for coffee, which Wren made on the tin stove while the rain continued its patient work outside. They sat at the rough table and the conversation moved through practical matters. The condition of the well wall, the coming season, the surveying instruments still stored in their wooden case beneath the cot, and whether Cody had the aptitude to learn their use. Ruth had opinions on all of it, delivered with the authority of someone who had been in this valley long enough to have made most of the relevant mistakes before anyone else had the opportunity. When Ruth left walking back to her farmstead through the diminishing drizzle, Wren stood at the door of the stone structure and looked at what the year had assembled around her. The well wall with its new lettering, the goats grazing on pasture that was already responding to the moisture, Cody at the fence line checking post tension on a section they had built in July, moving through the task with the focused competence of someone who had been becoming something more specific than a boy for quite some time now. She had come to this land with a dead man's notebook, the last of her money. No allies she could name, no plan beyond following the evidence to wherever it led. She had asked the land politely for its secrets, and it had answered not quickly, not cheaply, not without cost and labor and doubt, and the particular loneliness of a person who has staked everything on a reading of the ground that no one else could yet verify. The well was not the answer to everything. It was the answer to the question she had known how to ask, because James had taught her how to read the question in the first place. She owed him that. She intended to keep paying that debt forward, leaving things more legible for whoever came next. The way the Whitfields had, the way James had, the way every person does who understands that knowledge kept private dies with the keeper, while knowledge passed forward outlasts everything. Copper Creek ran clean by morning. The 60 acres that Cobre County's plat map still listed under the notation Garrett's Folly had a different name now in every conversation that mattered. It had the name of the woman who had read its grammar correctly, who had sent the right kind of army through its defenses, who had found at its highest point the answer to a question first asked 30 years before she arrived. The land had remembered what it held. She had remembered what she owed. In the accounting of the valley, those two facts balanced.